Good afternoon, Dr. Groarke. How are you doing today?
I'm well. If you don't mind, I'm going to apologize to our viewers about my tooth, which I have lost. And visual appearances are very important. And as I was saying to you, I get nervous about the inferences people make you are missing a tooth. But nonetheless, let's proceed.
Well, we really appreciate you joining us today. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I try to think about, what in my background made me what I am from the point of view of argumentation theory. And there's a couple things that come to mind. One is I would know I am an immigrant. My family immigrated from England, but really from Ireland when I was very, very young. But I think coming to a new country, Canada, which at least culturally was very different from the country the family had left, that made me inquisitive and shook me up in ways that led to curiosity about lots of things relevant to argumentation. And then very quickly, I would mention, I don't in a way like to say this, I'm one of identical triplets. So there's two others of me out there. And I think a kind of formative influence on me growing up now is Irish triplets was continually the back and forth between myself and my two sort of identical brothers. And, those are personal circumstances that I think kind of pushed me in the direction that I went.
That's interesting. I did not know that about you. So does that influence any of your ways you think about argumentation?
Well, I think it's strangely that it does, in that, unfortunately, there's been a lot written about these three, because all of us got PhDs in philosophy and all of us work in academia, and that has made people curious about who we are and how we do things. And what I would say is I was middle, actually from point of view of birth, but I was also the middle person in that I'm not quite sure why, but I would negotiate between my two brothers. And I was certainly the compromiser. They weren't inclined to compromise, and I would negotiate between them. And I think that very much led to the style that interests me in argumentation. Actually, as a university administrator too, I'm a great believer in negotiation and compromise, and there's a huge element of argumentation there.
Interesting. I like that, the reasonableness. You are the synthesis.
Reasonable, listening to both sides, finding middle grounds between them, and still sometimes in the family when there are issues, I'm called upon to negotiate, which can be very tiring, but I think there are a lot of skills there, and actually studying argumentation probably increased those skills and made them an emphasis of what I do.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So where did you study?
So, I studied in lots of places, the University of Helsinki, the University of Calgary, Simon Fraser University, and I ultimately got my PhD from Western University, which used to be called the University of Western Ontario. So I was at lots of different places, studying philosophy in all of them, but philosophy in ways that have a lot of relevance to argumentation theory.
Interesting. And who did you study with?
Well, it's funny, if I think of the formative people in my studying, I have to note that I began as a formal logician. I did mathematical logic. That's how I got introduced to logic, and logic for me was very much on the mathematical model side of things. And I had one very influential teacher, his name is Brian Chellis, who was a kind of world leader in the development of modal logic, possible world semantics, and that sort of thing. And that was a profound influence. And then what happened is I got a PhD and I got a job And partly because I had logic as a background, then I was told, well, now what you need to do is, of course, I did lots of formal logic courses, advanced logic, and that was an interest. But I was asked to teach introductory courses in logic, in critical thinking, in reasoning, to undergraduate students from all disciplines, you know, nursing, anthropology, science, etc. And lots of those students were not very comfortable with formal logic, but even more importantly, that got me interested in the study of everyday reasoning, what you read in the newspaper, what you see in television. So slowly I slipped from having a focus on formal logic to a focus on informal logic. And there my teachers were really Ralph Johnson, Tony Blair, the early people, Michael Gilbert, the early people in the informal logic movement. I learned from them, and I learned from teaching. But my real solid academic basis, it's formal logic, and it's still something of interest, but mostly I don't have time for it. But that's my real heritage, pedigree, whatever you want to call it.
Well, can you create, I like this distinction you're making. I was wondering if you can unpack it a little bit. What is the difference, you would say, between formal logic and informal logic?
So I would say that formal logic was interested in creating very transparent, I'm even going to say in some ways very simple models of reasoning. But what it was interested in was that they would be interesting from a mathematical or a formal point of view. Very explicit sets of rules of inference, decision procedures, proof procedures, and a whole lot of interest in not just specific arguments, but the whole system, completeness, okay? How do we know that a system is complete? And you know, Gödel's theorem and all sorts of stuff relates to that. So, and that's, I think, a fair pursuit. But when you try to take that and understand everyday reasoning by it, well, it turns out to have all sorts of shortcomings. And everyday reasoning, I mean, in one way, it's a lot messier, but actually it's much more complex. That's one of the issues. Though formal models and formal logics are getting better and better, and with AI are much better able to deal with real life reasoning. But real life reasoning is much more complex, and there are many different nuances to it that can't really be captured by formal systems very well. And they certainly can't be captured by propositional logic and predicate calculus, which is what we started with, or even modal logic. And I still have an interest in modal logic. But so mathematical systems are interesting. So formal logic is interesting, and sometimes it has lots of practical utility. But trying to understand these kinds of formal and to some extent artificial systems, that's quite a different endeavor than trying to understand how you and I argue and how the candidates for the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of Canada, how they argue. That's quite a different endeavor. And there's overlaps. There's still premises, conclusions, all the rest of it. But I slowly got pulled from one interest to the other.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. Are you saying when we argue, you and I, let's say if we get in a disagreement about what wine we should order tonight, I'm drinking something from a region of Spain that's red and smoky.
Okay, sounds good.
You might, or you may say that doesn't pair well with the steak that I'm ordering. That doesn't necessarily align with a mathematical formula. Sure,
though, you know, and maybe you can take formal systems and develop them in all sorts of ways. Let me give you one example, because I would say in my teaching and as I started to investigate informal logic and informal argument, I learned a lot, not just from philosophers, but from rhetoricians. I mean, and of course, Prince Tyndale is a very close colleague, and I've done lots of work with him. The traditional model of argument, the formal logic, the classical model is you have premises and they're true or false, and they lead to a conclusion, or they don't, they're valid and invalid. And the ideal is a sound argument with true premises that's valid leads to a conclusion. Well, just to take one example, but it's a profound example, there's no explanation of audience in this. And if you are going to argue in the real world, and if you're going to argue successfully in the real world, the idea that you don't pay attention to audience, well, it's a little bit crazy. I mean, if you want to be an effective arguer, you know, in my position, I argue with the government that it should provide my university with more funding. Where I need to start is by understanding what are the priorities of the government. And not just that, but how does it talk about things and what does it care about? And I need to address them. If I don't do that, I'm not an effective arguer. And even above and beyond that, if I'm going to understand the arguments that people are making, and whether it's in the newspaper or on television or in virtual reality, whatever, if I don't try to understand the audience towards their which they're directed, then I'm not going to understand those arguments. And look, that's a huge component of real life reasoning that just was not traditionally a part, and still is not really a part of formal logic. Part of my interest in modal logic is that I have a suspicion that you could squeeze a notion of audience into possible world semantics, but that's a long story. But I would also say that, you know, and I'm thinking of rhetoric here, or thinking of maybe take an example from dialectics. From the point of view of logic, the aim is to have a good argument. Premises are true, whatever that means, and we don't know what that means in a lot of situations, but the premises are true, they lead to a conclusion. Well, in dialectics, when I'm arguing with somebody else, let's say I'm bartering, we're negotiating, well, it's not enough to have an argument that's got true premises and is valid, has some conclusion. No, it's more complicated than that. There will be rules that we follow in our negotiations, things that are acceptable or not. So I would say real life reasoning and arguing is much more complex than is easily accounted for by formal logic. So it's a different endeavor. I still think there are connections and there are places we can learn from, one can learn from the other, but it is a different endeavor. And yeah, so instead of, you know, spending my time with mathematicians or with formal logicians, I end up spending my time with, of course, other philosophers interested in real life reasoning, but rhetoricians, dialecticians, people who do discourse analysis. That's kind of where my work fits in, I think.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So could you tell us, what do you think argumentation has to offer society in general?
Well, you know, I think most of us are motivated by a very deep belief that argumentation and the teaching of argumentation skills is absolutely fundamental to a successful society. And that's because it's an alternative to other ways of resolving disputes. And the other ways of resolving disputes, I mean, sometimes it's just peer pressure, or what did your parents teach you, or, you know, what are the assumptions in your society? Of course, in the worst cases, it's violence and it's war and it's, you know, the worst end of human behavior. So I am still an idealist, thinking that in argumentation, we're teaching people ways to resolve disagreement and to think about things in ways that are better than the alternatives. And from my point of view as a philosopher, reasonability and is very much a part of the way I think of things. And these are, reasonable ways to resolve things. So I think argumentation is tremendously important to society more broadly. And it makes me a bit sad that the critical thinking movement, I don't think has really been as successful as it should have been. Its ideals are absolutely the right ones, promote reflection and argumentation skills, but I don't feel it's been taken seriously in schools and often in colleges and universities, and especially it hasn't been taken seriously in systems of education where there's a lot of talk about critical thinking, but not really a deep understanding of argumentation and what it means and how it works.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that for a while, a lot of when you talk about critical thinking, that was what they were trying to implement at almost a systematic policy level, but it really didn't get there. The Common Core in the United States never really implemented those ideals fully, right?
Well, it started in California. There was, some interesting moves. But what I found is that the word critical thinking has been sort of co-opted. So it was invented by people like us who study argumentation and had a certain set of skills in account. But then people said, well, critical thinking, they made it into whatever they want, so they didn't need to study those skills. And I will tell you, I was visiting a university in Canada once, a smaller university, and I was very impressed. Before I went, I was giving a talk on something there. I looked at their catalog, their calendar, just to kind of see what they're about. And as being a liberal arts institution, all the rhetoric was, we teach critical thinking, and you should come to us because we teach critical thinking. Okay, well, that's pretty interesting to me as an argumentation theorist. So I'm going to talk. And then afterwards, I was talking to the president and other people, and I started to ask them, well, okay, what's your critical thinking model? Who do you have here who actually studies critical thinking? And it, from whatever perspective, discourse analysis, dialectics, rhetoric, what about in philosophy? Well, what it turned out is there is nobody there that studied critical thinking in the sense in which we talk about it in argumentation there. Nobody. And it's just a kind of crutch word that they use. And actually, I like the liberal arts, so good for them. But I think that's what's happened in most places. So people brag, well, I teach critical thinking. I teach history the way we taught it for years because history teaches critical thinking skills. So that makes me a little sad. But well, we just have to keep fighting the good fight and trying to make people understand a narrower notion of critical thinking.
Yeah, it almost seems like what you're saying is it's become a vague, ambiguous term that people just apply to things.
That's right.
Yeah. So what would you call your term or approach to argumentation?
Well, I would say that I do informal logic. And then I would probably quickly say that I do informal logic, but in a way that's influenced by argumentation theory in a broader sense. And particularly rhetoric and dialectics influence what I do, and I'm interested in what happens in those fields. So first and foremost, I teach and study informal logic, and then more broadly, I'm part of argumentation theory, and that's of course connected to all sorts of things like semiotics, communication study. That's how I would situate myself.
Yeah, no, I think that totally makes sense. Now, here is the thorny question I love asking because you get so many different answers. What is an argument?
So I'm going to say there's two senses of argument. And given my background, I favor one. One is argument is just disagreement. The sense that still interests me is the sort of logical sense that philosophers use. An argument is an attempt to justify a point of view with evidence, and we could say the evidence is presented via premises, and the standpoint that you try to justify is the conclusion. So that's the model that interests me and that I focus on. But there are broader models, and I recognize that. But I'm still interested. In that case, I would say maybe that's